You really think all this pageantry still matters? That's what Colonel Mason Briggs shouted in the middle of Wellington Barracks parade ground. But Sergeant Thomas Reid didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. His response was silent, but powerful. What happened next proved one thing beyond a doubt. Tradition will always outweigh rank. Curious how a British guard humbled an American officer without saying a word. Hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Wellington Barracks like a shroud, and in that grey pre-dawn light, you could feel the weight of 3 centuries pressing down on every polished boot that touched the ground. The Coldstream Guards had been standing at attention for 47 minutes, their red tunics pristine despite the London drizzle, their bearskin hats creating a perfect line of black fur that seemed to absorb the pale light filtering through the clouds. Sergeant Thomas Reid stood at the center of this formation, his body as rigid as the bronze statue of Wellington that watched over them from across the parade ground. At 34, Reid had seen enough of war to know that the most dangerous enemy wasn't the one who screamed and charged, was the one who waited, patient and silent, for the perfect moment to strike. His face was carved from granite, his eyes fixed on some distant point that existed beyond the physical world, beyond the here and now of ceremonial duty. But something was different that morning. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that made the younger guards shift almost imperceptibly in their ranks. Word had spread through the barracks like wildfire the night before. An American officer was coming to observe their training. Not just any American officer, but Colonel Mason Briggs, a man whose reputation preceded him, like the smell of gunpowder after a firefight. Briggs had arrived in London 3 days earlier as part of a joint military exchange program, one of those diplomatic initiatives designed to strengthen the special relationship between allies. On paper, he was there to observe and learn from British ceremonial traditions. In reality, he'd made no secret of his contempt for what he called parade ground nonsense and toy soldier theatrics. The man had spent his entire career believing that real soldiers were forged in the crucible of combat, not in the sterile perfection of ceremonial drill. The colonel's boots echoed across the parade ground with the kind of aggressive rhythm that announced his presence long before he came into view. Mason Briggs was a man who filled every room he entered. Not through physical size, though at 6'2" he was imposing enough, but through the sheer force of his personality. His chest was a patchwork of ribbons and medals, each one telling a story of service across 3 decades in the United States Army. Combat Action Badge, Bronze Star, Meritorious Service Medal, the full spectrum of military recognition decorated his uniform like a roadmap of his career. But for all his decorations, Briggs carried himself with the restless energy of a man who had something to prove. He'd grown up in the shadow of his father's legacy, a World War II veteran who'd stormed the beaches of Normandy and never let his son forget what real sacrifice looked like. To Mason Briggs, ceremony was weakness, tradition was stagnation, and the elaborate rituals of the British military were nothing more than expensive theatre designed to impress tourists and politicians. As Briggs approached the formation, Reid felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He'd been briefed on the American's attitude, warned about his tendency to provoke confrontation, but briefings were one thing, facing down a man who radiated aggressive skepticism was another entirely. The sergeant had dealt with skeptics before, but usually they were journalists or civilian officials who could be managed with polite diplomacy. This was different. This was a soldier challenging soldiers, and Reid understood that everything he and his men represented was about to be put on trial. The colonel stopped just 3 feet from Reid, close enough that the sergeant could smell the black coffee on his breath and see the small scar above his left eyebrow, a souvenir from some long-ago training accident or perhaps a bar fight in his younger days. Briggs's eyes swept over the formation with the kind of clinical assessment that came from years of evaluating troops. But there was something else in his gaze, something that went beyond professional curiosity into the realm of personal challenge. "So, this is the famous precision of the Queen's Guard," Briggs said, his voice carrying across the parade ground with the kind of projection that came from years of shouting orders over the noise of military exercises. "All this fuss for a damn costume party. You people really think standing around in funny hats makes you soldiers?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, and Reid felt every man in the formation tense. These weren't just uniforms, Being insulted, they were symbols of sacrifice, representations of men who had bled and died from Waterloo to Helmand Province. The bearskin hats that Briggs mocked with such casual disdain had been worn by men who charged into Napoleon's cannons, who held the line at Ypres, who fought house to house in the streets of European cities during the darkest days of the Second World War. Reid's response, when it came, was delivered with the kind of calm that only came from absolute certainty. His voice was quiet but carried the weight of conviction, each word carefully chosen and precisely delivered. "With respect, sir, these funny hats have stood on battlefields you've only read about." The silence that followed was deafening. Briggs's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Reid thought the American might actually swing at him. Behind them, the younger guards shifted, nervously, understanding that they were witnessing something that would be talked about in the barracks for years to come. This wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was a collision between two entirely different philosophies of what it meant to be a soldier. Reid's mind drifted, unbidden, to the mountains of Afghanistan, to the day that had changed everything. For him, he'd been a young corporal then, leading a patrol through the Helmand Valley when the world exploded in a symphony of automatic weapons, fire and improvised explosives. The memory was as clear as if it had happened yesterday. The acrid smell of cordite, the taste of dust and blood, the screams of wounded men calling for their mothers in languages that spanned continents. Private Williams had been 19 years old, fresh from training, when the IED tore through their convoy. Reid could still remember the boy's face, pale and terrified. A shrapnel painted the inside of their vehicle red. Williams had been hit in the leg, the femoral artery set, and Reid had known with the terrible clarity that comes in moments of crisis that the boy would die unless someone acted immediately. The firefight that followed had lasted 17 minutes, Reid knew because he'd timed it, watching the second hand on his watch tick by as he dragged Williams across 50 meters of open ground toward the relative safety of a bombed-out building. 17 minutes of hell, with bullets whining past his ears and rocket-propelled grenades exploding around them like deadly fireworks. But Reid had made it, had pulled the boy to safety, had applied the tourniquet that saved his life. Williams had survived, had gone home to his family in Wales, had married his childhood sweetheart, and now worked as a mechanic in Cardiff. Reid had a photo of the boy's wedding on his desk, a reminder of why precision mattered, why discipline was more than just following orders. It was about being ready for the moment. When someone's life depended on your ability to act without thinking, to rely on training so ingrained that it became instinct. But the memory that haunted Reid most wasn't the firefight itself, it was what came after. The ceremony, the simple, quiet moment when Williams had been presented with his Purple Heart, when the words for military merit and for wounds received in action had been spoken over a young man who would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. There had been no cameras, no crowds, just a handful of soldiers honoring one of their own in the way that soldiers had honored their wounded and their dead for centuries. That was when Reid had understood what tradition really meant. It wasn't about the uniforms or the pageantry or the elaborate choreography of ceremonial drill. It was about connection, a thread that linked every soldier to every other soldier who had ever worn the same uniform, who had ever taken the same oath, who had ever stood ready to die for something larger than themselves. Back on the parade ground, Briggs was circling Reid like a predator stalking wounded prey. The American's confidence was palpable, built on 3 decades of military service and the absolute certainty that he understood what real soldiering looked like. He'd commanded troops in Iraq, had overseen logistics operations that kept entire divisions supplied and mobile, had earned his rank through competence and dedication to duty. Big words for a man who spends his days playing dress-up, Briggs said, his voice dripping with condescension. Bet you couldn't last 5 minutes in real training. When's the last time you actually did something that mattered, Sergeant? When's the last time you put your life on the line for something more important than impressing tourists? Reid's eyes flicked to Briggs's ribbon rack, and in that moment, he saw the story of a career built on competence, but lacking in the kind of crucible moments that forged true understanding. Logistics command, staff postings, training assignments, valuable work, necessary work, but not the kind of work that taught you what it meant to hold a dying man in your arms while bullets flew overhead. Your file says you commanded a logistics battalion in Germany, sir, Reid said, his voice quiet but carrying the kind of deadly precision that came from absolute certainty. If you'd like a lesson in real soldiering, I'd be happy to arrange it." The words hit Briggs like a physical blow. Around them, the guardsmen drew a collective breath, understanding that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. In the rigid hierarchy of military protocol, what Reid had just done bordered on insubordination. But it was also something more. It was a challenge issued by a man who had earned the right to issue it. A gauntlet thrown down by someone who understood that respect was earned through action, not demanded through rank. The training exercise that followed was unlike anything the Wellington Barracks had seen in decades. Word spread through the military community like wildfire. An American colonel was going to put the Queen's Guard through their paces, and everyone wanted to see what would happen when ceremonial precision met battlefield reality. The course that Reid designed was a masterpiece of military training, combining the physical demands of combat preparation with the mental discipline required for ceremonial duty. It began before dawn, with both officers stripped of their rank, insignia, and dressed in identical training fatigues. The playing field was level, the rules simple: complete the course, or admit defeat. Reid had constructed a gauntlet that would test every aspect of military competence: marksmanship, physical fitness, tactical knowledge, and the kind of mental resilience that separated professional soldiers from weekend warriors. The first phase was a 5-mile run across the heath, weighted packs and assault rifles adding 40 pounds to each man's burden. Briggs started strong, his years of regular physical training evident in his steady pace and controlled breathing. But Reid moved with the kind of efficiency that came from understanding that endurance wasn't about raw strength, it was about conservation of energy, about finding the rhythm that could be maintained mile after mile, hour after hour. By the third mile, Briggs was beginning to show signs of strain. His breathing was becoming labored, his pace slightly irregular. Reid, meanwhile, seemed to glide across the terrain with the kind of effortless motion that made distance disappear. He wasn't showing off. There was no dramatic surge of speed, no obvious attempt to dominate. He was simply maintaining the pace that his body had learned through years of carrying wounded comrades across hostile terrain. The marksmanship phase revealed the true depth of Reid's expertise. The targets were set at distances that required not just accuracy, but the kind of precision that came from understanding how wind and weather affected bullet trajectory. Briggs was a competent marksman. His scores were well within military standards, his technique solid and professional. But Reid's shooting was something else entirely, each round placed with the kind of mechanical precision that suggested an almost supernatural understanding of his weapon. "Sniper training?" Briggs asked, genuine curiosity replacing his earlier antagonism. "Necessity," Reid replied, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "When you're responsible for keeping your squad alive, you learn to make every shot count." The tactical phase was where the real difference became apparent. Reid had designed a scenario based on his experiences in Afghanistan, a simulated patrol through hostile territory, with pop-up targets and split-second decisions that required not just military knowledge, but the kind of intuitive understanding that came from having made such decisions under fire. Briggs performed competently, his staff training evident in his methodical approach to each challenge, but Reid moved through the course like a ghost, his body memory guiding him through actions that had once meant the difference between life and death. He cleared rooms with a kind of fluid motion that suggested countless hours of practice, his weapon always pointing in the right direction, his positioning always optimized for both offense and defense. The final phase was the most revealing. Reid had constructed an obstacle course that required not just physical strength, but the kind of mental discipline that allowed a soldier to function under extreme stress. Mud, barbed wire, smoke grenades, and the constant sound of simulated gunfire. It was designed to push both men to their absolute limits. Briggs attacked the course with a kind of aggressive determination that had characterized his entire career. He threw himself at each obstacle, using raw strength and willpower to overcome physical challenges. But as the course progressed, his movements became increasingly desperate, his technique suffering as fatigue and frustration took their toll. By contrast, moved with the kind of calculated precision that came from understanding that every movement had to be economical, every decision had to be optimal. He didn't fight the obstacles, he flowed around them, through them, over them, using technique and timing to overcome challenges that would have stopped a less experienced soldier. When Briggs finally collapsed at the finish line, gasping for breath and covered in mud, Reid was standing over him, barely winded, The American's uniform was torn, his face streaked with sweat and dirt, his pride as battered as his body. But when Reid extended his hand to help him up, there was no mockery in the gesture, no attempt to humiliate a defeated opponent. "Lesson 1, Colonel," Reid said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Tradition isn't about the hat, it's about the men who earned the right to wear it." The weeks that followed brought a transformation that surprised everyone who witnessed it. Briggs didn't disappear in shame or transfer out in embarrassment. Instead, he threw himself into understanding what he had encountered, approaching the study of British military tradition with the same methodical determination that had characterized his approach to the obstacle course. He spent hours in the regimental museum, studying the battle honors that decorated the walls, reading the accounts of men who had carried the colors of the Coldstream Guards through 3 centuries of warfare. He learned about the Battle of Waterloo, where the Guards had held the line against Napoleon's final charge. He studied the trenches of the First World War, where an entire generation of Guardsmen had been ground to dust in the mud of Flanders. He read about the Second World War, about Guardsmen who had fought from Dunkirk to D-Day, who had liberated concentration camps and helped rebuild a shattered continent. But more than the history, Briggs began to understand the men who wore the uniform. He watched Reid train the younger Guardsmen, saw the patience and dedication that went into transforming civilian volunteers into soldiers who could be trusted with the ceremonial duties that represented their nation to the world. He observed the daily routine of military life, the 1,000 small disciplines that created the foundation for larger acts of courage and sacrifice. Most importantly, he began to understand that the precision of ceremonial drill wasn't separate from combat effectiveness. It was the foundation of it. The same attention to detail that allowed a guardsman to execute a perfect parade. Movement was what allowed him to field strip a weapon in the dark, to navigate by compass in hostile territory, to perform the countless small actions that kept him and his comrades alive in combat. The Queen's birthday parade took place on a perfect June morning, with London bathed in the kind of golden light that made the city look like a painting. The streets were lined with spectators, tourists and locals alike, drawn by the spectacle of military precision that had been perfected over centuries. But for those who understood what they were witnessing, the parade was something more than entertainment. It was a demonstration of the kind of discipline that had built an empire and defended a way of life. Reid led the Coldstream Guards with the kind of flawless precision that made the complex choreography of military drill look effortless. Every movement was synchronized, every step perfectly timed, every gesture a testament to the thousands of hours of training that had gone into creating this moment of perfection. The bearskin hats that Briggs had once mocked now seemed like crowns, symbols of a tradition that connected these men to their predecessors across the centuries. From his position in the reviewing stand, Briggs watched with the kind of respect that came from understanding. The American officer, who had arrived in London full of skepticism and contempt, was gone, replaced by someone who had learned that strength came in many forms, that discipline was not weakness but the foundation of all military virtue. As the band played God Save the King and the colors of the regiment fluttered in the morning breeze, Reid's eyes found Briggs in the crowd. For a moment, their gazes met across the parade ground, and in that instant, a understanding passed. Between them, the recognition of one professional soldier by another, the acknowledgement that they served the same cause even if they wore different uniforms. Later that evening, alone in his quarters, Briggs sat at his desk writing his report for the Pentagon. But beside his computer, carefully polished and gleaming in the lamplight, sat a small Union Jack pinner gift from Reid, a symbol of respect earned through trial and mutual recognition. Next to it was his own American flag pin, and together they represented something that couldn't be quantified in military manuals or strategic doctrine. The understanding that true strength came not from the loudest voice or the most aggressive posture, but from the quiet confidence of those who had proven themselves when it mattered most. The discipline that Reid and his guardsmen embodied wasn't loud or boastful. It was constant, patient, and unbreakable. It was the kind of strength that had built nations and defended civilizations, the kind of discipline that transformed ordinary men into something extraordinary. And Mason Briggs, career soldier and proud American, had learned that some lessons couldn't be taught in classrooms or commanded from headquarters. They had to be earned, one quiet moment of recognition at a time.